The wind was a blade against Alara's cheekbones. It cared nothing for the threadbare wool of her scarf or the hollow space in her belly that had long ago forgotten the memory of a full meal. Snow, driven hard and horizontal, had erased the world, leaving only a churning vortex of white and the skeletal fingers of pine trees clawing at a sky the color of lead. Her world had shrunk to this. The desperate hope of a rabbit in one of her father's old snares and the burning ache in her lungs with every breath. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull, grinding stone in her gut. It had started as a pang, a nuisance, but weeks of gnawing emptiness had turned it into a predator. It clouded her thoughts, made her hands tremble, and stole the warmth from her limbs no matter how close she huddled to the pitiful fire in her hearth. The people in the town of Promise, nestled in the valley below, had turned their backs. Since her father's passing, they saw her not as Martha and John's girl, but as an obstacle. Her quarter section, the one her father had bled for, was a prime piece of grazing land that Jedediah Thorne wanted to absorb into his ever-growing empire. Thorne's whispers had poisoned the well of community, painting her as proud and foolish for trying to hold on. Let the winter take care of her, he'd suggested in the general store, his voice slick with false pity. And so, the winter was trying. Each step was a negotiation with her own failing body. The snow was deep, a treacherous blanket hiding roots and rocks. She pushed onward, her focus narrowed to the next tree, the next landmark in a landscape rendered alien by the storm. This was the last of her trap lines, the furthest from the dubious sanctuary of her cabin. If it was empty, there would be nothing left. The last of the flour had been dust for 2 days, the final shriveled potato a distant, glorious memory. There was only hot water, a temporary trick played on a stomach that knew better. Despair was a cold, heavy thing, far heavier than the snow clinging to her worn coat. It threatened to pull her down, to convince her to simply lie down and let the white silence take her. It was her father's face, weathered and kind, that kept her moving. You're a daughter of this land, Alara. It's hard, but it's honest. You bend, but you don't break. The words, a phantom echo in the howl of the wind, were all she had left of him. So she bent her head against the gale and forced one frozen boot in front of the other. That's when she saw it, a smudge of darkness against the uniform white, near the base of a jagged rock outcropping that offered the barest shield from the wind. It was not the small, gray shape of a rabbit. It was too large, too still. Her first thought, a flicker of primal hope, was a deer fallen to the cold. Meat. A miracle. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings. She stumbled forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, a new, sharp-edged energy coursing through her. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not a deer. It was a horse on its side, its dark coat frosted with a layer of ice, its legs unnaturally still. And beside it, half buried in a drift, was the shape of a man. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her hunger. A man, out here, in this. She approached cautiously, her hand resting on the small, skinning knife at her belt, the only weapon she carried. The horse was dead, its eyes a milky, frozen glaze. The man lay face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something. A large, dark-brimmed hat lay a few feet away, an upturned bowl filling with snow. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat, but it was not enough. No coat was enough for this. She knelt, her knees sinking deep into the powder, and with numb, clumsy fingers, reached to touch his neck. He was a stranger. No one from Promise would be caught dead this high on the mountain in a blizzard. He was broad-shouldered, even in stillness. She pressed her fingers against the side of his throat, under the line of a strong jaw darkened with stubble. She expected the cold, unyielding feel of death. She waited, and then, beneath her fingertips, a flutter, a weak, thready pulse, as slow and sluggish as sap in deep winter. He was alive. The knowledge hit her not with relief, but with a crushing weight of responsibility. Her own life was a flickering candle flame, one gust away from being extinguished. How could she possibly take on the burden of another? The pragmatic, starving part of her whispered to walk away. He was a dead man already. Drawing out the process would only endanger her. She had no food, no medicine, barely enough would to keep her own small cabin from becoming a tomb of ice. To try and save him would be to sentence them both. She stayed kneeling, the snow seeping through the knees of her canvas trousers, the wind screaming its indifferent song around her. She looked at his still form, at the way the snow was gently, murderously blanketing him. She thought of Thorne's smug face, of the town that had left her to die. They would do the same for this stranger. They would call it God's will or nature's way. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. It was not a grand, noble decision. It was a small, stubborn spark of defiance. Her father had never walked away from man in need. He had taught her that the hardness of the land should never be allowed to harden the heart. To leave this man would be to let the winter and Jedediah Thorne and all of it win. It would be to become the cold, empty thing they all expected her to be. You bend, but you don't break. Damn you, she whispered, the words snatched away by the wind. Damn you for not having the decency to die somewhere else. With a groan that was part pain and part resolve, she set to work. Getting him onto his back was a monumental effort. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone that her starved frame could barely manage. When she finally rolled him over, she saw his face. It was hard-boned and angular, etched with lines that spoke of sun and hardship. A dark gash, crusted with frozen blood, ran from his temple into his hairline. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the denim of his trousers taut over a clear break below the knee. A fall. The horse must have slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow. She couldn't carry him. It was impossible. But her father's sled, the one he used for hauling firewood, was back at the cabin. It was a half-mile that might as well have been 100. Stay alive, she commanded the unconscious man, her voice thin but fierce. You hear me? You just stay alive. She turned and began the agonizing journey back. She did not allow herself to think about the impossibility of the task. She focused only on the next step, on the image of the sled, on the weak pulse that had beaten against her fingers. The wind pushed and clawed at her, trying to force her back, to trip her up. The hunger gnawed, a vicious beast inside her. But now, it was not just her own life she was fighting for. It was his. And in that shared struggle, she found a sliver of strength she didn't know she possessed. She had found a man in the snow, and in the act of saving him, she was refusing to let the wilderness, or the cruelty of men, claim her. She was still Alara, John's daughter, and she would not break. The sled was a brutal burden on the return journey, its wooden runners catching on unseen obstacles, its weight a constant drag against her depleted strength. Every muscle screamed. Her vision swam with black spots, the world tilting and swaying. But she reached him. He was still there, a darker mound in the ever-deepening white, the pulse still a faint, stubborn rhythm against the encroaching death. Getting him onto the sled was a nightmare of grunting, slipping, and raw determination. She leveraged his dead weight inch by agonizing inch, her breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. The sky was darkening, the short winter day surrendering to a long, merciless night. Finally, he was on. She wrapped his body as best she could with his own bedroll, which had been tied behind his saddle. She took the reins of the sled, leaned into the harness she'd fashioned from the horse's tack, and began to pull. The journey back to the cabin was a descent into a private hell. The wind howled with a new, vicious intensity. The weight behind her was immense, an anchor pulling her down into the snow. She fell, time and again, her face plunging into the biting cold. Each time, she forced herself up, her hands raw, her body a symphony of pain. She talked to him, her words a low, desperate mantra. Just a little further. We're almost there. Don't you die on me. Don't you dare. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. When the dark shape of her cabin finally emerged from the swirling snow, tears of raw relief froze on her eyelashes. The last few feet were the hardest. She stumbled through the door, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards, the sled, and its occupant just inside the threshold. For a long moment, she lay there, unable to move, the silence of the small room a deafening contrast to the storm outside. The fire in the hearth was down to a few glowing embers, the room's cold almost as bitter as the air outside. With the last dregs of her will, she pushed herself up. She barred the door against the storm, then turned her attention to the man. Dragging him off the sled and closer to the hearth took another eternity. She cut away the fabric of his trouser leg with her skinning knife. The break was bad, the bone pushing against the skin, the flesh around it already swollen and dark. She knew next to nothing about setting bones, only what she'd seen her father do once for a calf. It would be crude. It would be agony for him, if he could feel it. She found the last of her father's whiskey, a finger's width in the bottom of a bottle saved for a day of celebration that would never come. She poured a little between the man's cracked lips, hoping it might dull the pain or at least fight the deep chill in his core. Then, using 2 split lengths of kindling and strips torn from her own spare blanket, she did her best to straighten and splint the leg. A low groan escaped him, a sound of pure misery that twisted her gut, but he did not wake. She cleaned the gash on his head as best she could with snow melted over the reviving fire. His breathing was shallow, his skin unnervingly cold to the touch. She stripped off his frozen outer layers and covered him with every blanket she owned, piling her father's old greatcoat on top. Only then, when he was settled and the fire was fed and beginning to push a small circle of warmth into the room, did she allow herself to stop. She sank onto the small stool by the hearth, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and exertion. The cabin was a single room, sparse and worn. A narrow cot, a rough table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and a few shelves holding her meager possessions. It had always felt small, but now, with the presence of the large, unconscious stranger, it felt impossibly crowded. The hunger returned with a vengeance, a physical pain that made her double over. She had nothing, not a crumb. Her eyes fell on the man's saddlebags, which she had dragged in from the sled. It felt like a violation, a betrayal of the very principle that had made her save him. But the gnawing in her stomach was a more powerful force than propriety. Her hand shook as she unbuckled the stiff, frozen leather. Inside, she found a canvas pouch of dried jerky, a small sack of coffee beans, and a half-full tin of hardtack biscuits. It was a treasure trove, a king's feast. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the food. She took out a single biscuit and a strip of jerky. It was his. She would take only enough to keep herself on her feet, enough to keep them both alive. She broke the biscuit in half, saving the rest. As she chewed the hard, tasteless bread, it was the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. She boiled snow and threw in a handful of the precious beans, the rich, dark aroma filling the cabin, a scent of life in a room that smelled of sickness and snow. She sat by the fire, sipping the hot, bitter coffee, and watched the man. He was a complete unknown, a danger, a burden. He was also the only other human being she had shared a room with in months. In the flickering firelight, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. Who was he? Where was he going in a storm that had killed his horse? She had saved his life for now, but in doing so, she had tied her fate to his, binding them together in a desperate fight against the unforgiving white world outside. The storm raged on, and in the small, quiet cabin, 2 lives hung in a delicate, uncertain balance. For 3 days, the world remained a maelstrom of white. The wind shrieked, piling snow in great drifts against the cabin walls, sealing them in. Time dissolved into a cycle of tending the fire, melting snow for water, and watching the stranger. Alara portioned out his jerky and hardtack with miserly care, allowing herself just enough to quell the worst of the hunger pains and keep her strength up. She forced broth made from boiled jerky between his lips, a slow, painstaking process. He remained lost in a fevered state, sometimes murmuring words she couldn't understand, his body shivering despite the mountain of blankets. On the 4th morning, she awoke to a profound silence. The wind had died. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the single grime-coated window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She got up, her joints stiff and sore, and looked out. The world was transformed, a pristine, glittering landscape of impossible beauty and lethal cold. When she turned back to the hearth, his eyes were open. They were the color of slate, clear and startlingly alert in his pale face. He didn't speak, just watched her, his gaze moving from her face to the splinted leg propped on a rolled blanket, to the fire, and back to her. There was no confusion in his eyes, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. Alara's heart gave a little jump. The unconscious burden was now a conscious man, a stranger in her home. Fear, which had been a dull companion, sharpened. "The storm broke," she said, her voice rough from disuse. It felt strange to speak to someone other than herself. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. His gaze dropped to the empty mug and the small piece of jerky on the crate beside him. He knew she had been in his bags. "My horse?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, gravelly and deep. "It didn't make it," she said softly. "I'm sorry." He closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing his features. It was the only emotion he showed. When he opened them again, they were as opaque as stone. "You pull me out." It wasn't a question. "You were freezing to death." "And using my supplies to keep from starving to death," he stated, his eyes fixed on her. There was no accusation in his tone, merely observation. Shame, hot and unwelcome, washed over her. "I took only what I needed." "You took less than you needed," he corrected, his gaze sweeping over her gaunt frame. "And you set the leg." He tried to shift, and a sharp intake of breath betrayed the pain. "It's a rough job," she admitted. "It was the best I could do." He was silent for a long time, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. She felt stripped bare, her poverty, her desperation, all laid out for his inspection. She was used to the pitying or contemptuous glances of the people in Promise. This was different. It was a weighing, a measuring. "Silas," he said finally. "Alara." And that was the extent of their introductions. The silence that fell between them was heavy, but no longer threatening. An understanding had been reached without the need for more words. He knew she had saved him. She knew he understood her desperation. A fragile truce was established in the quiet cabin. The days that followed developed a slow, deliberate rhythm. Survival was a full-time occupation. Silas, despite his immobility, began to direct their efforts with an economy of words and a wealth of knowledge that humbled her. He showed her how to improve her snares, how to place them in the game trails near the cabin she hadn't even known existed. He taught her to read the subtle signs in the snow, the tracks of a snowshoe hare, the depression where a grouse had burrowed for warmth. "The wire's too low," he'd say, watching from his cot as she prepared a snare. "Rabbit's head will pass right under. Need to be 4 fingers off the snowpack. No more, no less." She would listen, her pride warring with the simple, undeniable fact that he was right. Under his tutelage, their luck changed. A day after she reset the snares' way, she caught a plump hare. The smell of roasting meat in the cabin was intoxicating, a scent of victory against the encroaching famine. They shared the meal in near silence, but it was a companionable quiet. He insisted she take the larger portion, his slate-gray eyes daring her to argue. "The one doing the work needs the fuel," he stated, and the matter was settled. He was a man of immense practicality. He had her bring him his saddlebags, and from them, he produced a whetstone and began to meticulously sharpen her father's old axe and her skinning knife until they had edges she could have shaved with. He showed her how to braid cordage from the sinew of the hare, wasting nothing. He was constantly occupied, his hands busy carving, mending, sharpening. He seemed constitutionally incapable of idleness. One evening, as she sat mending a tear in his coat, the needle moving with slow, careful stitches, a sound from outside made them both freeze. It started as a low, mournful cry and was answered by another, then another, until the night was filled with the chilling harmony of a wolf pack. The sound was close, too close. Alara's blood ran cold. Wolves, made bold by hunger, had been a problem all winter. She'd heard them, but never this near the cabin. She looked at Silas. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on the door. "How many round for the rifle?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "4," she whispered. It was all she had left. "Hand it to me." She retrieved her father's old Winchester from its pegs on the wall and passed it to him. He checked the action with an expert's familiarity, the metallic click loud in the tense silence. He propped himself up straighter on the cot, the rifle resting across his lap, its barrel pointed toward the door. "The axe," he said, nodding toward the hearth. "Keep it by you." She did as he said, her hand closing around the smooth, worn handle. They waited, two people in a tiny wooden box, surrounded by the hungry wild. The howling grew louder, circling the cabin. A scratch, tentative at first, then more insistent, sounded at the door. A low growl rumbled just outside. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She stood frozen, her knuckles white on the axe handle. She looked at Silas. He hadn't moved. His breathing was even, his focus absolute. He was a rock in the face of a threat, and his stillness calmed the frantic fluttering in her own chest. He was not afraid, or if he was, he showed no sign of it. He was simply ready. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, a silent, unified front. He, the wounded but capable protector. She, his unproven but determined backup. The scratching stopped. The howling receded, moving off into the forest. The immediate danger had passed. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with the release of tension. She sank onto her stool, the axe suddenly heavy in her hands. Silas laid the rifle aside. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond quiet assessment. It was a flicker of respect. "You did good," he said softly. The simple words landed in her heart with surprising weight. No one had told her she'd done good in a long time. She had been fighting alone for so long, and in that moment of shared peril, she had felt like part of a team. She had not been just the starving girl in the cabin. She had been a defender of their small sanctuary. As his legs slowly began to heal, the dynamic between them settled into a comfortable partnership. She was his legs, and he was her teacher. She would describe the landscape to him, the way the snow looked on the pines, the color of the sunrise, and he would tell her what it meant. Where the snow was likely to be deepest, where the ice would be thin on the creek, where the deer would shelter from the wind. He was teaching her the language of the mountains, a language she had lived in her whole life but had never truly understood. He revealed little of himself. He never spoke of where he was from or where he was going. But she pieced things together from the calluses on his hands that were not of farmers, from the way he handled the rifle, from the scars she saw on his torso when she helped him change his dressings. This was a man who had seen violence, who had lived a life far from the quiet toil of a homestead. Yet, in her presence, he was gentle. His gruffness was a protective shell, not a core of unkindness. One afternoon, he held out a piece of pine he had been carving. In his palm was a small, perfectly rendered figure of a grouse, its feathers intricately detailed. "For you," he said, not meeting her eyes. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth, delicate lines. It was a simple, beautiful thing, a gift given for no reason other than to be given. In a world that had been reduced to the stark necessities of survival, it was an act of profound grace. She looked from the bird to his face and saw a faint flush on his high cheekbones. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. She placed the small wooden bird on the mantelpiece, where it stood as a quiet testament to the change that had taken place. The cabin was no longer a prison. The stranger was no longer a threat. The gnawing hunger in her belly had been replaced by the quiet, steady sustenance of shared purpose. She was still Alara, but she was no longer just John's daughter, clinging to a legacy. She was a survivor, learning her own strength, taught by a man who had appeared out of the snow like a ghost and had, against all odds, become her anchor. The winter still held them in its grip, but she no longer faced it alone. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. It began as a whisper, the sound of a single drop of water falling from an icicle on the eaves. Soon, the whisper became a murmur, then a steady drumming as the sun gained strength, its light no longer pale and thin, but a warm, golden wash over the valley. The world began to weep, the great drifts of snow shrinking, the creek reappearing from its icy tomb, its voice a happy gurgle. The air grew soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine resin, the perfume of life returning. With the melt, the world outside the cabin became accessible again. Silas, now able to move with the help of a crude crutch Alara had fashioned for him, began to venture out for short periods. His leg was healing, the bone knitting with the slow, stubborn patience of nature. He moved with a limp, but with a growing confidence that mirrored the reawakening of the land. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. He taught her how to properly fell a dead-standing pine for firewood, his instructions precise and clear. Watch the lean. Make a notch deep. Plan where it will fall. She swung the axe, her muscles, now fueled by a steady diet of rabbit and grouse, responding with a strength that surprised her. The tree fell exactly where he said it would, its crash echoing in the quiet woods. The sound was not one of destruction, but of provision, a preparation for the future. The feeling of hope was a fragile, unfamiliar thing. For so long, her future had been a blank wall of white, a question of surviving until the next sunrise. Now, with Silas beside her, the future began to take shape. It looked like a repaired fence line, a tilled garden plot, a roof that didn't leak. The inevitable day came when the track down to promise was clear enough for a man on foot. It was Jedediah Thorne who broke their hard-won peace. Alara saw his buggy first, a black speck moving slowly up the muddy track. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. Thorne never came up the mountain. His business was conducted in the valley, in the bank, in the saloon, where his influence was absolute. For him to come to her meant he believed her to be at her end. He was coming not as a neighbor, but as a vulture. "We have a visitor," she said, her voice tight. Silas followed her gaze from the doorway. He said nothing, but his body went still, the easy posture of a moment before replaced by a watchful tension. He leaned his crutch against the cabin wall and stood on his own 2 feet, his weight resting more on his good leg, but his stance solid, immovable. Thorne pulled his horse to a halt a few yards from the cabin, his eyes taking in the scene with a smug, proprietary air. He was a large man, soft in the way of men who live off the labor of others. His face was florid, his waistcoat straining at the buttons. He didn't get down from the buggy, a clear sign of his disdain. Well, Alara," he called out, his voice oozing a false heartiness that set her teeth on edge. "Survived the winter, I see. The Lord is merciful." He made it sound as if she'd cheated. "I'm still here, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice level. She stood on the small porch, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from trembling. Thorne's gaze slid past her to Silas, who stood silently in the shadows of the doorway. A slow, malicious smile spread across Thorne's face. He let his eyes travel from Silas's rough-mended coat and limping stance back to Alara's face, his expression thick with insinuation. "I see you haven't been alone," he said, drawing out the word. "Found yourself some company to while away the cold nights. Though I'd have thought you'd aim higher than a half-crippled drifter." The insult, crude and deliberate, was aimed at her, but it was Silas he was trying to provoke. Alara felt a surge of white-hot anger. In the past, a comment like that would have shamed her into silence. She would have dropped her gaze, her face burning, and endured it. But the woman who had survived this winter was not the same girl who had entered it. Before she could speak, Silas took a single, deliberate step out of the shadows and into the sunlight. He didn't say a word. He simply looked at Thorne. His face was impassive, his slate gray eyes cold and flat. There was no anger in his expression, but something far more unsettling, a complete and utter absence of fear. He held Thorne's gaze, and in that silent contest of wills, Thorne was found wanting. The bigger man's smug smile faltered. He shifted in his seat, the leather creaking. This was her fight. Alara knew it. Silas was her silent support, but the words had to be hers. She lifted her chin, her voice ringing out in the clear spring air, sharp and clean as an axe blade. "This is my land, Mr. Thorne, my home, and this man is my guest. You are not welcome here. State your business or leave." Thorne was taken aback. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a frightened, broken girl he could easily intimidate. He was facing a woman he did not recognize. Her eyes, clear and direct, held no trace of fear. He recovered, his face darkening with anger. "My business? My business is the loan your father took against this land. The loan that is 3 seasons past due. I hold the note, girl. This land is as good as mine, and a word from me at the bank is all it will take." "Then go to the bank," Alara said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Try and take it. You'll find I'm not so easily moved." "Is that a threat?" Thorne blustered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He looked at Silas again, as if seeking a weaker target. "You, what's your name? What's your stake in this?" Silas remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He simply let Thorne's blustering words hang in the air and die. His silence was more powerful than any threat he could have uttered. It unnerved Thorne completely. The man was accustomed to deference, to fear, to the loud and boisterous language of power. He did not know how to deal with this quiet, unyielding man or the defiant woman standing before him. He looked from one to the other, seeing not 2 desperate stragglers, but a unified front. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the sharp axe leaning by the door, the quiet capability in their posture. He had come expecting to kick over a ruin, and had found a fortress. "You'll regret this," he snarled, his authority crumbling into petty spite. "Both of you, when you're begging for scraps in the street, you'll remember this day." He yanked hard on the reins, turning the buggy so sharply that mud sprayed from the wheels. He whipped the horse and rattled away down the track, a retreating storm of impotent fury. They stood and watched until the buggy was out of sight. The silence it left behind was profound. The air smelled of pine and damp earth again. The only sound were the creek and the birds. Alara's legs suddenly felt weak. A tremor ran through her, the delayed reaction to the confrontation. She had stood her ground. She had faced a man who personified all her fears, and she had not flinched. She had spoken the truth of her own strength, and he had been forced to retreat. She turned and looked at Silas. He was watching her, and a look in his eyes made her breath catch. The respect she had seen before was there, but it was deeper now, mingled with a warmth that reached all the way to the cold, lonely places inside her. He reached out, not with his hand, but with his words. "You didn't need me to speak." "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I needed you to stand there." He gave a slow nod. "I wasn't going anywhere." In that moment, the final wall around Alara's heart crumbled. The partnership forged in the crucible of winter, in the shared fight for survival, had been tested by the outside world and had held fast. It was no longer just about survival. It was about building a life. He took a step closer, his limp more pronounced now that the tension had passed. "That loan," he said, "the one he holds. I have some money, saved from, before, enough to clear it." She stared at him, stunned. "Why? Why would you do that?" "This is good land," he said, his gaze sweeping over the valley, the trees, the mountain peaks still capped with white. "It's honest land. It deserves someone who will fight for it." He looked back at her. "Someone like you." Then he added, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "But it's too much for one person. It needs 2 pairs of hands." He wasn't offering charity. He was offering a partnership, a real one. He was offering to invest his future right here with her. Tears she hadn't shed in the depths of hunger or fear now welled in her eyes. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had come into her life as a burden, a broken man she had rescued from the snow out of a stubborn refusal to be beaten. But he had been the one to rescue her. He hadn't fought her battles for her. He had shown her the strength she already possessed to fight them herself. He had seen her, truly seen her, when she was invisible to everyone else. A week later, they rode to promise together. She, on a gentle mare he had purchased from a trapper downriver, and he on a sturdy gelding, his posture straight and confident in the saddle despite his healing leg. When they walked into the bank, side by side, a hush fell over the room. Thorne was there, speaking to the manager. The look on his face, as Silas calmly counted out the full sum of the debt in gold coin, was a sight Alara would treasure for the rest of her life. The banker, a man who had previously looked through her, now met her eye with a newfound respect. They didn't linger in town. They bought seeds, a new plow blade, coffee, and flour. As they loaded their supplies, Alara felt the stares of the townspeople. They were no longer looks of pity or scorn. They were looks of curiosity, of caution, of grudging admiration. She was no longer the poor, abandoned girl on the mountain. She was Alara of the Silas and Alara homestead. They were a unit, their quiet strength a tangible thing. The ride back up the mountain felt different. It felt like coming home. The sun was warm on their backs, the air alive with the buzz of insects and the song of nesting birds. The land, their land, was waking up, bursting with potential. They stopped at the crest of the ridge, overlooking their valley. The cabin sat nestled below, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The small clearing they had marked out for a garden was a patch of dark, rich earth waiting for seed. "It's a start," Silas said, his voice quiet beside her. Alara looked at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun caught the silver at his temples. Her world had once been a single, cold, starving room. It had been a place of fear and despair. Now, she looked at the vast, beautiful, demanding land spread before her, and at the quiet, capable man beside her, and she knew her world was right here. He had not come and made her his whole world with grand pronouncements or sweeping gestures. He had done it slowly, quietly, by showing her how to rebuild her own, and then choosing, with every deliberate action, to build his right alongside it. She reached out and laid her hand over his on the pommel of his saddle. His fingers curled around hers, his grip warm and firm. "Yes," she said, her heart full. "It's a beautiful start.